and he preached good news to the people. Return by rejoicing. After hearing the warnings of John the Baptist, the people said, "What shall we do?" And he told them, "Those with an extra coat, give one away. Tax collectors, don't take extra for yourself. Soldiers, don't abuse your authority." Now, most there weren't tax collectors or soldiers. He was giving rules of thumb. Painting with a broad brush, he was speaking the same message to everyone. In other words, live a pure and generous life. Then he gave further warnings. One mightier than I is coming. His winnowing fork is in his hand to clear the threshing floor and to gather the wheat into his barn, but the chaff he will burn with unquenchable fire. God will save those who keep his warnings. He will judge those who don't. With this message, I had to wonder, is this the best text to preach on Gaudete Sunday? Gaudete means rejoice. So this is called Refreshment Sunday of Advent. I thought maybe I should focus on the other two readings, which specifically mention rejoicing. But then I noticed Luke's ending to this passage about John the Baptist. Did you catch it? So with many other exhortations, he preached good news to the people. Did his words sound like good news to you? Well, we know it's good news if we widen the lens and consider the context. John the Baptist is calling God's people to remember their first love, their first joy. He's calling them to renewal through generosity. The broader message is, you can be generous if you remember how God is generous to you. It's also good news because God is sending a gift in the form of the Messiah. One mightier than I is coming, John says. In other words, the Messiah will come to set things right. So God has already given himself to Israel, and now he's coming as Savior. Luke wrote this gospel while looking back at how Jesus came to save those who return to him. So let's summarize John's message. Return to God, your first love. Rejoice that he's coming again, and then respond with generosity. This brings renewal. So this is a good passage to preach on Gaudete Sunday after all. But let's ask some questions. Why were some of God's people hoarding clothes and food? Why had some of them become tax collectors who defrauded their own people? Why were Herod's soldiers abusing their authority over their fellow Jews? The answer is that they were oppressed by Romans and resources had become scarce. The people were acting out of fear. In essence, John the Baptist is saying, don't act like godless people. Have no fear. The king is coming. If we widen the lens in this way, then the theme of John the Baptist is similar to what we have in the other two readings. The words from Zephaniah, "Rejoice and exult with all your heart, O daughter of Jerusalem. The King of Israel, the Lord, is in your midst. You shall fear evil no more." This is even more true after the king has come in the flesh and will yet come again. As Paul says, "Rejoice in the Lord always. Again, I will say, rejoice. The Lord is at hand. Have no anxiety about anything." But how do John's words apply to us today in our time of abundance? Not many of us are tax collectors defrauding our fellow churchgoers or are abusive soldiers in the church. But we do have our own fears, and that has a way of squelching joy. Our fears create a scarcity mindset. Well, what fears? Well, let's start with this one. How about the fear of missing out? FOMO, as it's often called. With this in mind, let's consider John's exhortation. He who has 2 coats, let him share with him who has none. And he who has no food, let him do likewise. Or he who has food, rather, let him do likewise. We can ask, does that describe how I go about my life? Now, there's a lot you can miss out on, which can make you feel poor in relation to others. The stock market is rising. I need to make sure I get a piece of that. Gee, look at what other kids are doing. I need to make sure that mine measure up. Well, I'd like to help them tonight, but I need to catch up on the series on Netflix. Otherwise, what am I going to talk about at work tomorrow? Now, you can fill in the blanks about where your own FOMO creates a scarcity mentality. But let me share an application with myself. The starting line of bike races, I had a so-so bike. I noticed my equipment was inferior to my competitors. Most of them showed up with 2 bikes worth twice my own. I shook my head about this one day, talking to my wife, lamenting, kind of, about the cost of some of our life choices. And here's what Abby said. Be like Eric Liddell. He always had the worst equipment. She explained that she had read his biography to our kids when they were young. He became the fastest runner in the world, but he came from a missionary family without much money. He was shorter than his competitors, and he wasn't formed by the best coaches. And you know what? This is all I needed to hear to change my thinking. Why? Because I knew about Eric Liddell's faith from the movie Chariots of Fire. He said, God made me fast, and when I run, I feel God's pleasure. He recognized God as the source of his gift, and this was his primary joy. I made the connection. Since nothing could take God away, I could have no fear of missing out. So forget the bike. Let me just feel God's smile like Eric Liddell. I'll illustrate some more from his life. When a competitor didn't have what he needed, Eric would freely share. Back then, you had to dig your feet into the ground in order to be able to push off on the clay track. And so he would offer his shovel to his competitors. Once, he drew by lottery the best position to start a race, but he quietly gave his spot to a competitor and took the worst place on the outside. These examples helped to bring my faith back into racing and make me more generous. So let's outline these principles in light of John the Baptist's call so we can learn from them, okay? Return to God. Eric Liddell recognized God as the source of his strength. Rejoice in his gifts. Eric took joy in this reality. Therefore, he could respond with generosity. What a vision for our lives. So the question for us today is, what is your race? What makes you feel like you need to get more from this world? John the Baptist is saying, you have God. Put him first. And what's more, he's coming again. So have no fear and be generous. Now, I could stop here, and at first this was all I was going to say about Eric Liddell. But I need to continue, because later in life, he filled the exhortations of John the Baptist more thoroughly. And here's why this matters. Because if you can change your mindset right now, like he did, address the simple fear of missing out, then you can be prepared for real scarcity. So first I'll briefly bring everyone up to speed with his Olympic achievement, but the real witness comes after that. You know, I'm always surprised when I hear most of the people younger than me, they haven't seen the movie Chariots of Fire, and they don't know what happened in the 1924 Olympics. But that's when the stakes got higher for Eric. He found out that his main event was on a Sunday, but he'd already been vocal about his belief that Sunday should be set apart for worship. So he refused to run. But the people of Scotland had put their national hope in him winning a medal, so the media called him a traitor. But he stuck to his first love and didn't fear the loss of favor in the eyes of man. Famously, he won the gold medal in a race on Tuesday that didn't match up with his experience. That was the 400. He hadn't really prepared for that. But he was adored by the public once again after he got that gold medal. But here's the thing. From then on, he could have continued with a life of fame and fortune, but he didn't choose that. You see, the proverbial tax collector in John's exhortation isn't satisfied with making a simple living. He wants more, fear of missing out. But instead, Eric went on to be an anonymous missionary in China. While there, the circumstances became worse than he could have imagined. The Japanese invaded China and put all foreigners in a prison camp. While there, he encountered the kind of oppression and scarcity that faced the people of God at the time of John the Baptist. And guess what happened? The people acted the same way as they did then. The oppression and the scarcity made them turn inward, and many became more cruel to one another than the Japanese guards were to them. Now, the question is, how would you act in those circumstances? Well, let me tell you, the missionaries were some of the worst offenders, not pulling their weight in hoarding. Enter Eric Little. Give your second coat to those who have none. When Eric saw a boy who had a propensity for running, Eric gave him those running shoes that he wore in the Olympics, carefully mended and preserved. Give your food to those who are hungry. He often gave up his meager rations to others and also convinced other prisoners to stop hoarding their food. What about the exhortation to the soldiers? Don't extort others. Well, the principle behind this is don't use your privilege for your own advancement. When Churchill negotiated a prisoner exchange, word came that Eric was on top of the list, but he gave up his position so that someone else could go home. Far from abusing privilege, he gave up his privilege for others. Does this remind you of anyone? How about our Lord Jesus Christ, who, in the form of God, counted equality with God not something to be grasped? So now, how did Eric do these things? What made him more generous? He simply returned to God constantly and rejoiced. One of his colleagues said that even during Japanese occupation, Eric always radiated a deep kind of joy. He said himself, "Focusing on one's work is irritating, but when one's eyes are focused on God, the face is lit up." Now, Eric came down with an undiagnosed illness at the camp, but he continued to pour himself out each day, playing sports with the youth and leading Bible studies to the point of collapse. And on his deathbed, they played his favorite hymn, one that he often shared with others to encourage them. It illustrates that we need not fear because Jesus has come, and in his coming again, he can always give us joy. Let me just share a few words of this hymn. before we close. Be still, my soul, your best, your heavenly friend. Through thorny ways, he leads to a joyful end. Be still, my soul, the waves and winds still know his voice who ruled them while he dwelt below. Be still, my soul, your Jesus can repay from his own fullness all he takes away. Now, can you relate to the call of John the Baptist? Can you relate to the outsized life of Eric Liddell and how he honored that call? Well, it all began with simply conquering the fear of missing out while practicing his side hobby of running. At the most basic level, he always returned to God. He rejoiced in God's gifts and the one who was always coming, and he was generous in the small things. If we start here, then we will be prepared as well when the stakes get higher. You know, one of his secular biographers, a sports writer, said that Eric received much, so he gave much. But his Christian biographers knew his motivation better. So sure, he was fast, but all he really cared about was Jesus, and you and I have no less. Liddell said that while he honors hard work, nothing compares to Jesus' work on the cross. Jesus came and gave all for you. He continues to give, and as he gives to you, he gives through you. So our fears still get in the way, but the imperative for John the Baptist remains for us today. Return to God, who returns to you. Rejoice in his gifts, and then you can renew your generosity.